My name is Thurmond Graft Hollinger. I'm a fungal architect who survived the first 48 hours of the zombie outbreak in Barrows Point, Maine. I watched an engineered fungus transform my neighbors into mindless hosts while the military abandoned us. Now I'm trapped in my lab with dwindling supplies, an experimental treatment, and infected breaking down the doors. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Thurmond Hollinger. Most people called me Graft. I'm recording this for anyone who's still alive and listening. If you're watching this, it means my broadcast reached someone. I don't know how long I have before they break through, so I need to be thorough, but quick. I'm currently barricaded inside the secure cultivation chamber of my laboratory in Barrows Point, Maine. The doors are reinforced, but they won't hold forever. The infected are persistent. They want what I have in here. They want me. Before everything happened, I was a mycological architect. That's a fancy way of saying I grew buildings from mushrooms. I engineered fungi to create sustainable building materials, everything from insulation to structural supports to self-healing surfaces. My company, Mycotech Solutions, was pioneering the field of fungal architecture. The irony isn't lost on me. I spent my career convincing people that fungi were humanity's future, that mycelium networks could help us build a sustainable world. I never imagined they'd be our downfall. I need to tell you how this started, so you understand what we're facing. 2 weeks ago, local fishermen began pulling in catches with strange white growths. After the big storm surge, unusual patches appeared along our shoreline. The Marine Department researchers dismissed it as a harmless algal bloom. When I examined samples as a favor to a fisherman friend, I saw high-fall structures I'd never encountered before, aggressive colonization patterns with unusual branching. I told them to isolate it. They laughed, called me the mushroom man, and said I was seeing fungi everywhere. I wasn't laughing 3 days later when old Pete Dawson collapsed at the harbor. Pete had been cleaning boats near the affected shoreline for days, often without gloves. They rushed him to Barrows Point General with what they called a seizure. 12 hours later, hospital security footage showed him attacking a nurse. The video was grainy but unmistakable, small, branching structures protruding from his ear, canal and along his jawline. Classic fungal fruiting bodies but on a human host. That's when I knew we were dealing with something that had jumped from marine life to humans. Let me explain what this infection does, in terms anyone can understand. The fungus doesn't kill its host, it hijacks it. The spores germinate in warm, damp tissue, lungs, sinuses, ear canals, and then the mycelium networks through the nervous system until it reaches the brain. It's similar to cordyceps fungi that control insect hosts in nature, but this strain is uniquely adapted to human neural pathways. Once the fungus reaches the brainstem, it assumes control of motor functions while suppressing higher cognitive processes. The host remains alive, but loses all autonomy. Their only drive becomes spreading the infection to new hosts. The fruiting bodies that emerge release clouds of spores when the host encounters potential new victims. The first 12 hours after Pete's incident were chaos. Cases multiplied throughout Barrows Point. Our town only has about 3,000 residents, and by nightfall, at least 50 were showing symptoms. I called everyone I could think of: the CDC, my university colleagues, state emergency services. Most lines were busy. Those who answered thought I was crazy. By nightfall, they weren't answering at all. I packed essential supplies at my apartment: food, water, basic protective gear. I knew I needed to reach my lab across town. I had been developing an antifungal compound for treating contaminated building materials. It was experimental, never meant for human use, but it was all I had. I was sealing my makeshift mask when I heard knocking. It was Mrs. Peabody from across the hall, the sweet old lady who ran our post office. She was swaying slightly, eyes unfocused. She asked if I had any aspirin for her headache. As she spoke, I noticed she kept scratching behind her right ear. That's when I saw it. The slight discoloration at her hairline, the early stage of fungal colonization. I backed away, told her I didn't have any medication. Her movements became jerky, uncoordinated. When she looked at me again, there was nothing human left in her eyes. Just hunger. Not for flesh, but for new hosts to spread to. Her neck bulged, strangely, and I knew what was coming. I slammed my door just as she convulsed, releasing a cloud of spores into the hallway. I escaped down the fire escape as more infected entered my building. On the street I saw others running, screaming. Some were clearly infected, pursuing those who weren't. The air felt thick, contaminated. I pulled my vinegar-soaked cloth tighter over my face. An acidic environment makes it harder for spores to germinate. Not foolproof, but better than nothing. As I ran toward the commercial district, I noticed something odd. The infected weren't just attacking randomly. They seemed drawn to certain areas, gathering like spores clustering before germination. I didn't understand the pattern yet, but that observation would later save my life. In the distance, I spotted a military helicopter circling. For a moment, I felt relief. Help was coming. Then I watched it bank away from town, heading inland without landing. No evacuation, no rescue. We were being contained, not saved. I needed shelter to regroup and plan my route to the lab. Jensen's grocery was just ahead, its metal security shutters partially lowered. I ducked inside, finding about a dozen other survivors who had the same idea. They were barricading the doors with shelving units and freezer cases. Among them was Martin, a dock worker who knew every street in town. Sarah, a nurse still wearing blood-spattered scrubs, and the Jensen family. Tom, Linda, and their teenage son, Tommy. They were arguing about what to do next when I entered. "It's not a virus," I announced, drawing their attention. "It's a fungal infection, and it's spreading through spores, not just direct contact." They looked at me like I was insane. Tom Jensen scoffed. "A mushroom? You're saying mushrooms are turning people into zombies?" "They're not zombies," I explained, dropping my backpack. "The infected aren't dead. The fungus needs a living host with functioning circulation. It's why they move differently than what you've seen in movies." Sarah stepped forward. "He's right about them not being dead. I was on shift when they brought Pete Dawson in. His vitals were stable even when he was unconscious. Then he woke up and attacked Dr. Miller. His strength was unnatural." I asked her about symptoms progression. She confirmed what I feared. The timeline from infection to full conversion was accelerating. The first cases like Pete took nearly 12 hours. Newer infections were turning in 4. "There are warning signs," I told the group, hoping to give them some control in the chaos. "Initial symptoms include headaches, disorientation, and skin irritation. Then comes muscle spasms, auditory hallucinations, excessive sweating. The scratching is key. They all do it, same spot behind the ear or at the base of the skull. It's the mycelium reaching the brainstem." Tommy Jensen had been quiet, sitting on the floor near the water display. I noticed he was sweating despite the cool temperature in the store. His mother was rubbing his back, telling him everything would be okay. He kept scratching the same spot on his neck. "How long has he been like that?" I asked quietly. Linda glared at me. "He's fine. Just scared. We all are." But Tommy wasn't fine. His eyes were glassy, his breathing shallow. He'd been helping unload fish deliveries at the family store that morning. Direct contact with contaminated catches. I tried to warn them, but it was too late. The transformation was faster in kids. Their immune systems didn't know how to fight it. One minute Tommy was crying about the pain in his head. The next his eyes glazed over and he lunged at his mother's face. Martin and Tom restrained him while he thrashed and hissed, a milky film forming over his eyes. They locked him in the storage room, his mother's sobs echoing through the store. We tried the emergency broadcast radio. For a while we received fragmented messages about containment zones and evacuation centers, then contradictory information about quarantine protocols. By hour 18 the power went out across town, and with it our last connection to the outside world. The last broadcast just told everyone to stay indoors and wait for evacuation, Martin said, peering through the slats of the security shutters. But I saw military vehicles turning people away at the bridge. There's no evacuation coming. I knew then that waiting for rescue was futile. I explained about my lab and the antifungal research. It wasn't much, but it was the only hope we had. We mapped a route through town, avoiding the areas where we'd seen infected clustering. We gathered supplies and improved our protective gear. Sarah showed us how to create makeshift hazmat suits using plastic trash bags and duct tape. Martin knew which buildings had roof access, so we could move above street level, where spore density would be lower. We prepared to leave at dawn, when the infected seemed less active. As we made final preparations, I watched Martin carefully. He had been unusually quiet for the past hour, and I noticed a slight tremor in his left hand. When he thought no one was looking, he scratched behind his ear. I said nothing, but I kept him in my sight. We couldn't risk another Tommy situation. Looking out at the darkened town through a small gap in the shutters, I noticed the infected weren't randomly shambling anymore. They were gathering in concentric patterns around certain buildings, almost like they were receiving instructions. They moved with a strange synchronicity that sent chills through me. Later, I would understand what I was seeing, but in that moment, watching their organized movements, I only knew one thing for certain. Whatever was controlling them was far more intelligent than we realized, and it was learning. The sun began to rise on our first full day of the outbreak. We finished our preparations in silence, each lost in thoughts of what waited outside. Sarah distributed masks soaked in vinegar solution. Martin checked the route map one last time. Tom Jensen stared at the storage room door, behind which his son occasionally scratched and thumped. Linda approached me, eyes red but determined. "You really think you can stop this with your mushroom research?" I couldn't lie to her. "I don't know, but doing nothing guarantees we lose." She nodded and handed me a small canister of pepper spray from behind the counter. "Tommy always loved science," she said quietly. "He would have thought your job was cool." We left Jensen's grocery just after dawn. The morning fog hung heavy over Barrows Point, which was both blessing and curse. It provided cover from the infected but limited our visibility. We pushed freezer units against the front doors before we left, but I knew it wouldn't hold them for long. Glass doesn't stop. Spores. Our group moved in tight formation through the back alley. Martin led the way with a hand-drawn map. Sarah kept watch behind us with a fire axe, and I stayed between them with the Jensen couple. Tom had insisted on bringing a baseball bat from the sporting goods section. Linda carried nothing but a small photo of Tommy. She hadn't spoken since we locked the storage room door. "Stay low and quiet," Martin whispered as we approached Main Street. "Remember, they track by sound and movement." The town I'd called home for 5 years was unrecognizable. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles. Store windows were shattered, and everywhere a fine white powder dusted the surfaces. Spore fallout. In just 24 hours, the infection had transformed our coastal community into something alien. I need to explain how our group functioned because it might help you form your own survivor units. Sarah had been on shift when the hospital fell, so she had medical supplies and knowledge. Martin knew the town's layout intimately, every shortcut, every building with roof access. The Jensens provided food from their store, and I understood the enemy we were facing. "Tell us more about these things," Martin asked as we rested in an insurance office after covering 3 blocks. "You said they're not dead, but they're not exactly alive either, right?" "They're both," I explained. "The human host is alive, heart beating, lungs functioning, but their brain has been rewired. The fungus forms a network inside them like a secondary nervous system. It preserves basic functions but overrides conscious control." Sarah nodded grimly. "That explains why sedatives didn't work at the hospital. We tried everything to subdue Pete, but nothing affected him." "The fungus doesn't respond to human pharmaceuticals," I said. "It's why we need my lab. I have cultures of competitive fungi that might inhibit the growth." "What are our chances?" Tom asked bluntly. "Really?" I couldn't lie to them. "Slim, but better than doing nothing." As we planned our next move, I shared what I knew about infection progression. Early warning signs included headaches, disorientation, and irritation at infection sites, usually the respiratory system or open wounds. Middle symptoms progressed to muscle spasms, auditory hallucinations, and excessive sweating. By the final stage, visible growths would appear, followed by personality changes and aggression. The scratching is the most obvious tell, I emphasized. Always at the infection site, usually behind the ear or at the base of the skull. It's the mycelium reaching the brainstem. Sarah was examining Martin as I spoke. He'd been unusually quiet since we left the grocery store. "You feeling okay?" she asked him. "You're sweating a lot." "It's just the exertion," he replied quickly. Too quickly. "And these plastic suits are hot." I noticed he kept flexing his left hand, opening and closing it rhythmically. A nerve response to early mycelium growth. My stomach tightened. Martin had been helping at the docks yesterday morning before coming to the grocery store. He'd handled the same contaminated catches as everyone else there. We needed to address it, but not there in the open. We continued moving, reaching Barrow Street, which would take us across town, toward the industrial district where my lab was located. The street was worse than the others, more infected, moving in those strange coordinated patterns I'd noticed earlier. "We need to go around," I whispered, pointing to a service alley. We retreated quietly, but not before I noticed something disturbing. The infected weren't randomly distributed. They clustered around the hospital, the police station, the radio tower. Centers of potential information or resistance, almost like they were guarding them. We found temporary shelter in the Barrows Point Community Bank, its heavy security doors still intact. Inside, we found evidence of a last stand, overturned furniture forming barricades, emergency supplies scattered about. But no bodies, no blood. Just abandoned belongings and a fine layer of white spore dust. While the others searched for useful supplies, I pulled Sarah aside. "Martin's infected," I said bluntly. She looked at me sharply, then over at Martin, who was studying his map across the room. "Are you sure?" "Left hand tremor, excessive sweating. He keeps scratching the same spot on his neck. He worked the docks yesterday morning." She closed her eyes briefly. I suspected. His pupils are uneven, and he flinched when I checked his temperature. Early neurological symptoms. "How long do you think he has?" "Hard to say. 6 hours maybe. The progression is accelerating with each new case." The implications were grim. Martin was our navigator, our guide through town. Without him, finding the fastest safe route to my lab would be much harder. But we couldn't trust him as the infection progressed. His judgment would become compromised, then his loyalty, then his humanity. "We don't tell the Jensens yet," Sarah decided. "They're barely holding it together after Tommy. But we watch Martin closely. First sign of aggression, we contain him." I agreed. Though containment was easier said than done, we'd seen the strength the infected displayed. Pete Dawson had thrown 2 orderlies across a room. Tommy, just a teenager, had required 2 grown men to restrain him. As we prepared to move again, I studied the map with Martin, memorizing as much of our route as I could. His knowledge might soon become unavailable to us. "You studied this fungus, right?" he asked suddenly. "What happens to people after they turn? Are they aware of what they're doing?" The question caught me off guard. Was he feeling the changes begin? Wondering what awaited him? "I don't know," I answered honestly. "This strain is unlike anything I've studied before. But based on other neurological fungal infections, I suspect there's some level of awareness trapped beneath the fungal control, like being locked in your own body, watching but unable to stop yourself." He nodded slowly, his eyes focused somewhere distant. "That would be worse than death." "Martin," I said carefully, "if you're not feeling well, you need to tell us. For everyone's safety." Something flickered across his face, fear, resignation, I couldn't tell. Then he straightened up and folded the map. "I'm fine. Just tired. Let's keep moving." We left the bank through a rear service entrance, moving in smaller side streets to avoid the main roads where infected congregated. The day was heating up, making our makeshift protective gear uncomfortable. Condensation formed inside our masks and the vinegar smell was overwhelming. but removing them meant exposure to airborne spores. Communication was failing across town. We passed the local radio station, its windows shattered and doors torn open. Inside, I glimpsed infected staff members still seated at their desks, fruiting, bodies sprouting from their heads and shoulders like grotesque crowns. The last broadcast we'd heard had just told everyone to stay indoors and wait for evacuation. But Martin had seen military vehicles turning people away at the bridge. There was no evacuation coming. We were on our own. As we moved through an apartment complex courtyard, Linda Jensen suddenly stopped, pointing wordlessly to a second-floor window. A family huddled inside, children pressing small hands against the glass. Uninfected survivors. Tom immediately wanted to help them. "We can't just leave them," he argued. "We can't save everyone," Sarah countered. "We barely have enough supplies for ourselves." I understood both perspectives. Each survivor meant more hope for humanity, but each new person also meant more risk, more responsibility. In the end, practicality won out. We couldn't safely extract them without exposing ourselves, and our mission to reach the lab took priority. We left supplies at their door with instructions on safer areas and continued on, their faces haunting us. By mid-afternoon, we'd covered about half the distance to my laboratory. We took shelter in a dental office to rest and rehydrate. The building's ventilation system had excellent filtration, making it relatively spore-free inside. Martin's condition was deteriorating faster than Sarah had predicted. His coordination was failing, and he had difficulty focusing on conversations. The tremor in his hand had spread to his arm, and he was constantly scratching at his neck, which now showed visible discoloration. "I need to check your wounds," Sarah told him firmly, approaching with her first aid kit. "Stay back," he warned, voice strained. "I know what's happening to me." The Jensens looked on in horror as Martin finally admitted what we had suspected. "I got splashed with tank water at the docks yesterday. Didn't think anything of it until the headache started at the grocery store." "Why didn't you say something?" Tom demanded. "Because you would have left me behind," Martin answered simply. "Or locked me up like Tommy. I needed to get you as far as I could first." His selflessness was admirable, even as the infection rewrote his brain chemistry. I wondered how much of that was Martin, and how much was the fungus ensuring its carrier completed some goal before full conversion. "How much further to your lab?" he asked me, handing over his map. "About 2 miles, through the industrial district." He pointed with a shaking finger to a route highlighted in blue. "Take this way. Service tunnels under the main street. Maintenance workers use them. Less exposed than the surface." Sarah approached him cautiously. "Martin, we might be able to help you if we reach the lab in time." He shook his head. "Don't lie to make it easier. I can feel it in my head now, like fingers pressing against my thoughts." He looked at me directly. "Study this graft, make it mean something." Then, before any of us could react, he bolted from the dental office into the street. The sudden movement and noise immediately attracted nearby infected. As they converged on him, he ran in the opposite direction from our planned route, drawing them away from us. It was the last selfless act of a man who knew he was beyond saving. We watched from the window as he disappeared around a corner, a dozen infected in pursuit. We never saw him again. The Jensens were shaken by Martin's sacrifice and revelation. "How do we know none of us are infected?" Tom asked, eyeing everyone suspiciously. "We don't," Sarah replied. "That's why we watch each other. First sign of symptoms, we deal with it." It was harsh but necessary. We couldn't afford another surprise like Martin. With our guide gone, navigating became more challenging. We followed his map as best we could, finding the maintenance tunnel entrance he'd indicated. The tunnels were dark, but relatively free of infected, though the damp environment was ideal for fungal growth. I noticed white patches spreading along the walls and ceiling, the infection colonizing even non-living surfaces. "The fungus is spreading beyond human hosts," I explained as we moved carefully through the dim passageways. "Those white mycelium networks on the walls are the same organism. The infection is terraforming our town." "Like in those alien invasion movies?" Tom asked. Exactly like that. Except the alien is microscopic and was probably in our waters for weeks before we noticed. The maintenance tunnels led us to within half a mile of the laboratory complex. As we emerged into late afternoon sunlight, I spotted something that confirmed my growing suspicions. The infected were moving with purpose, not the random shambling we'd seen earlier. They traveled in groups, responding to signals we couldn't perceive. They react to vibrations, I told the others as we hid behind a dumpster. Footsteps, voices, anything that could lead them to new hosts. But they're virtually blind. Their eyes cloud over with the same white film that eventually covers their skin. We use this knowledge to our advantage, creating distractions to draw infected away from our path. Tom would throw objects in the opposite direction, the noise attracting their attention while we slipped past. Sarah had been quiet for the past hour, conserving her energy. I noticed she seemed fatigued, moving more slowly than before. When she thought no one was looking, she checked her pulse, a concerned expression crossing her face. Her medical training made her dangerous. She knew exactly how to hide symptoms. But I noticed the slight tremor in her left hand, the way she'd flinch at loud sounds. Classic early neurological involvement. "Everything okay?" I asked her quietly, as we paused to check the map. "Fine," she answered too quickly. "Just tired." I didn't press the issue. We needed her medical expertise to reach the lab, and confronting her might cause her to flee like Martin or become hostile. Instead, I watched her carefully, noting every grimace and hesitation. As we approached the industrial district where my laboratory was located, I noticed something disturbing about the fungal growth. The patches on buildings near the lab complex were different, redder, more vascular than the pure white growths we'd seen elsewhere. The fungus was adapting, evolving in real time. "Nature always finds a way," I murmured, studying the unusual coloration. "What does that mean?" Tom asked, pointing at the reddish growth. "It means the fungus is changing, evolving to better survive in its new environment. That's what makes it so dangerous. It learns from each host it infects." In the distance, we could see the Mycotech Solutions building, my laboratory and research facility. It stood relatively intact, its modern architecture distinguished by the living mycelium facade I designed, an ironic touch given our current situation. More concerning was the evidence of military presence around the complex. Abandoned Humvees, discarded weapons, tactical gear. They had come here specifically, likely seeking the same research I hoped to access. "They knew," Sarah said, examining shell casings on the ground. "The military knew what was happening and came for your research." "Question is, did they find anything useful before they were overrun?" Tom added. That question haunted me as we prepared for our final approach. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the industrial park. Soon we would reach my laboratory, either our salvation or just another dead end in a dying world. We approached my laboratory with extreme caution. The Mycotech Solutions building stood 4 stories tall, its exterior partially covered with the living mycelium facade I'd designed, engineered fungi that processed carbon dioxide and generated small amounts of electricity. Under normal circumstances, I would have been proud to show it off. Now the sight filled me with dread, wondering if my work had somehow contributed to this nightmare. "We need to wrap our faces tighter," I instructed, helping the Jensens adjust their vinegar-soaked masks. "The spore density near the lab will be higher, especially with those red growths we observed." Sarah nodded, her movements slightly sluggish. "The vinegar disrupts spore germination. The acidity damages the outer protective layer." We wrapped fabric soaked in vinegar around our faces. The acidic environment makes it harder for spores to germinate. Not foolproof, but better than nothing. We'd been using this technique since leaving the grocery store, refreshing the vinegar solution whenever possible. The final approach to the laboratory required crossing an open parking area. No cover, completely exposed. We waited until dusk, hoping the reduced visibility would work in our favor. The infected seemed slightly less responsive in low light conditions, their visual processing already compromised by the fungal growth over their eyes. We move fast. We stay together, Tom said, gripping his baseball bat. Any sign of those things, we change direction immediately. Linda hadn't spoken much since leaving the grocery store, but she'd become increasingly observant. They're moving in patterns, she said quietly. Look at them. She was right. The infected weren't randomly wandering. They patrolled specific routes, maintaining roughly equal distance from each other. It reminded me of ants following pheromone trails, or the organized distribution of mycelium networks in forest floors. They're communicating somehow, I realized. The fungus is creating a network between hosts. This insight proved valuable as we plotted our path across the parking lot. We timed our movement between patrol patterns, using the infected's own organization against them. We reached the building's service entrance without incident. I entered my access code, praying the emergency power system was still functioning. The lock clicked, and the door opened to a dimly lit corridor. After securing the door behind us, we removed our outer protective layers to avoid bringing external spores inside. The fungus was spreading beyond human hosts. White mycelium networks spread across building facades through ventilation systems, along water pipes. The infection was terraforming our town, converting it into a massive fungal colony. Inside, the laboratory showed signs of hasty evacuation. Desks were overturned, equipment scattered. Personal items left behind in the rush to escape. Coffee mugs still half full, family photos still standing. Lives interrupted mid-moment. The power was running on emergency systems, casting everything in a dim blue glow. Where's your research? Kept? Sarah asked, leaning against a wall. Her breathing had become labored. Third floor secure cultivation chamber, I answered. Climate-controlled environment for growing experimental strains. Tom examined the emergency exit plan mounted on the wall. Any other survivors might be holed up there too. I doubted it, but didn't discourage the hope. Hope was currency now, more valuable than food or weapons. We moved carefully through the ground floor, checking each room. The cafeteria had been ransacked, but we found some sealed energy bars and bottled water, which we distributed quickly. Military was definitely here, Tom observed, pointing to discarded tactical gear and shell casings. Looks like they entered in force, then left in a hurry. Or returned, I thought, but didn't say. The evidence suggested a planned operation, not just a random security check. They'd come specifically for my research. The question was, why? We located the emergency stairwell, avoiding the elevators, which wouldn't be running on backup power anyway. As we climbed, I noticed that Sarah was struggling, falling behind. Linda stayed with her while Tom and I scouted ahead. She's infected, isn't she? Tom asked quietly when we were out of earshot. I nodded. There was no point denying it. Early stages. Her medical training helps her manage the symptoms, but it's progressing. Like Martin. Yes. He tightened his grip on the baseball bat. If she turns on us, especially in this confined space. I know. The implication was clear. We might have to neutralize someone who had been helping us survive. But her medical knowledge is crucial if we're going to synthesize any treatment. We need her functional as long as possible. On the second floor, we found the first bodies. Lab technicians, security personnel, and what appeared to be military specialists in partial hazmat gear. No obvious injuries, no blood, just corpses with fungal growths emerging from facial orifices. They had been dead for hours, maybe a day. Don't touch anything, I warned as Tom reached toward a military radio. Even the dead can release spores, if disturbed. We regrouped with Sarah and Linda before continuing to the third floor. Sarah's condition was deteriorating faster than I expected. Her left hand now shook continuously, and she had developed a noticeable facial tic. She caught me watching her. I was exposed at the hospital, she admitted. Patient spore release during intubation. I knew when the headache started this morning. Why didn't you say anything? Linda asked. Same reason as Martin. Wanted to get us as far as possible first. She managed a weak smile. Besides, I've Been monitoring my own progression, taking notes, medical data that might be useful. Her dedication was remarkable. Even as the infection rewrote her neural pathways, she remained focused on contributing to a solution. I wondered how much of that was Sarah's medical training, and how much was the fungus ensuring its host reached the laboratory, the apparent target for so many infected. We reached the third floor, which housed the main research laboratories. The destruction here was more extensive, suggesting targeted searching rather than panic. Microscopes lay shattered, computer screens cracked, sample storage units emptied. They were looking for something specific, I noted, examining the selective nature of the damage. Not just general containment. Your research? Tom suggested. Possibly. Or anything that could explain the outbreak. As we moved through the research floor, I explained more about what we were seeing. They react to vibrations, footsteps, voices, anything that could lead them to new hosts. But they're virtually blind. Their eyes cloud over with the same white film that eventually covers their skin. We approached the secure cultivation chamber, a sealed, climate-controlled room where we grew our most sensitive fungal cultures. Its reinforced door was designed to maintain perfect growing conditions inside and prevent cross-contamination. Now, it might serve as our last refuge. The door was ajar, its electronic lock damaged by gunfire. Someone had forced their way in. We approached cautiously, weapons ready. I peered inside and felt my heart sink. The cultivation chamber had been ransacked. Growth trays overturned, cultures destroyed, equipment smashed, and in the center of it all, a figure hunched over one of the intact cultivation beds. James? I called softly, recognizing my research partner. The figure turned slowly. James Chen had been my colleague for 3 years, a brilliant mycologist who had helped develop our most successful architectural fungi. Now his face was partially obscured by white fungal growths emerging from his left eye and mouth. But unlike the other infected we'd encountered, his movements were controlled, almost normal. "Graft," he said, his voice raspy but intelligible. "You came back." I kept my distance, signaling the others to stay back. "James, can you? Am I infected?" "Obviously." He gestured to the growths on his face. "Am I still me?" "Partially. For now." The conversation was surreal. Every other infected we'd encountered had been completely overtaken, reduced to shambling spore dispensers. James seemed to retain significant cognitive function despite the advanced growths. "How is this possible?" I asked, fascinated and horrified. The others lost all higher brain function. "Not all, some of us are different." He tapped his temple with a trembling finger. "The fungus needs coordinators, nodes in the network." Sarah stepped forward, medical curiosity overriding caution. "You're conscious? Aware of what's happening to you?" James nodded. "Aware, but not in control. Not completely. I can communicate, think, but my actions serve the network." The implications were staggering. The fungus wasn't just creating mindless hosts. It was preserving intelligence where useful, creating a hierarchical infection structure. "What happened here?" I asked, gesturing to the destruction around us. "Military came, looking for your cultures. The competitive inhibitor strains." He pointed to a specific cultivation bed. "They took samples. Most were already infected, left in a hurry." "Why those strains specifically?" "They knew." His expression twisted in what might have been pain or resistance. "They knew what was in the water. Engineered cleanup gone wrong." A terrible suspicion formed in my mind. "James, what was in the water? What is this fungus?" He struggled visibly, fighting either the infection or some programmed restriction. "Project Remediation, marine biotechnology prototype, designed to break down hydrocarbons, plastic pollution, but it evolved. Adapted to target organic carbon compounds, like those in our nervous system." The horror of it sank in. This wasn't a natural mutation. The fungus had been engineered for environmental cleanup, then evolved beyond its parameters. Someone had created this nightmare in a misguided attempt to solve another problem. Is there a way to stop it? I asked urgently. James gestured to the back of the cultivation chamber where a sealed storage unit remained intact. Your competitive inhibitor cultures, the ones that outcompete aggressive decomposers. They might work, not a cure. But containment. Sarah had been observing our exchange carefully. Now she staggered, catching herself on a workbench. It's accelerating, she gasped. The progression. I can feel it reaching my brainstem. James looked at her with something like recognition. You're turning, becoming part of the network. Tom raised his baseball bat defensively, but I held up a hand to stop him. Sarah, what do you need? I asked. She handed me her medical kit. Now you're the doctor, Graft. I'm just another sample. Her hands were steady even though we both knew what was coming. Lock me in the observation room. Study the progression. It might help. Her scientific detachment was admirable, if heartbreaking. We helped her into an adjoining observation room designed for monitoring experiments without contamination risk. Through its glass wall, we could document her condition while remaining safe. James, I turned back to my infected colleague. How much longer can you maintain this level of awareness? Hours. Maybe less. His voice had grown more strained. The network is calling me elsewhere, important tasks. What tasks? What is the fungus trying to accomplish? Spread, survive, evolve. He rose unsteadily. It's not malicious, just efficient. Humans are ideal hosts, with our mobility and social structures. And the red growths we saw? The ones different from the white? Second generation. Adaptation. His eyes flickered with what might have been fear. More efficient neural integration. The network is becoming smarter with each host it takes. The implications were terrifying. The fungus wasn't just spreading, it was learning, improving its method of control with each new infection. The red variety represented an evolution of technique. I have to go, James said suddenly, moving toward the door. Others are coming, they sense you here, uninfected tissue is valuable. Wait, I called. How are you communicating? How does the network coordinate? Chemical signals, electrical, impulses through connected mycelium. He paused at the door. Like a giant brain spread across the town. Each infected is a neuron. Each spore release a synapse firing. With that disturbing metaphor, he left. We didn't try to stop him. In his current state, he was more valuable as an information source than a captive or casualty. Tom and Linda were struggling to process everything they'd heard. So this thing was made by people? Tom asked incredulously. Some corporation or government? Apparently. I moved toward the storage unit James had indicated. Project remediation. Probably well-intentioned. Plastic pollution is destroying marine ecosystems. Good intentions, road to hell, Linda muttered. The storage unit required my biometric scan, which still worked despite the emergency power. Inside were preserved cultures of my competitive inhibitor fungi, strains designed to outcompete aggressive decomposers in building materials. They weren't developed for medical use, but the principle might translate. Through the observation window, we could see Sarah recording her own symptoms on a notepad, her handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. She had inserted an IV line into her own arm, prepared to become both researcher and subject. What do we do now? Linda asked, looking between Sarah and the cultures I was carefully removing. We work, I said simply. We use what we have. Sarah's medical knowledge, James's insights, my cultures. We try to develop something that might help. Tom secured the cultivation chamber door, barricading us inside. The reinforced walls and filtered ventilation system would keep external spores out while we worked. We had water, some food, and the most important thing, purpose. As night fell over Barrows Point, we started the desperate race against time. Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly, but she remained lucid enough to guide me through basic medical procedures. I set up an improvised laboratory using the intact equipment, preparing to test my inhibitor cultures against samples of the infectious fungus. Through the observation window, I watched as small fruiting bodies began to emerge from behind Sarah's ears. She documented each change meticulously, her dedication unwavering even as her humanity slipped away. It was both horrifying and inspiring. Outside, we occasionally heard movement in the corridors, infected searching for us, but the sounds were coordinated, methodical. They weren't randomly shambling, but hunting with intelligence. James had been right about the network. The fungus was operating as a distributed intelligence, using its hosts as extensions of itself. I worked through the night, examining Sarah's blood samples, comparing them with the progression patterns in tissue cultures. The fungus was unlike anything I'd studied before, aggressive, adaptive, and somehow both beautiful and terrifying in its efficiency. Linda assisted me, following instructions precisely despite her lack of scientific background. Tom maintained watch, alert for any breach in our security. We functioned as a unit, our fear channeled into productive action. As dawn approached, I made my first tentative breakthrough. One of my inhibitor strains showed promising results in a test culture, creating a defensive boundary that the infectious fungus couldn't easily penetrate. It wasn't a cure, but it might slow the progression enough to give the human immune system a fighting chance. The infected were gathering outside our laboratory, drawn by the presence of uninfected hosts. Their movements had that strange synchronicity I'd observed earlier, as if coordinated by an unseen intelligence, which in a sense they were, the distributed fungal network growing throughout Barrows Point. By morning, I had established a basic understanding of the infection mechanism. Working through the night with Linda's assistance, I examined Sarah's blood samples under the laboratory's microscopes. The fungus propagated through the bloodstream after initial spore germination, targeting nerve pathways like highways to the brain. They'd been here before us, I explained to the Jensens as we took a brief rest. Hazmat teams, military personnel. They came for the same reason we did. The evidence suggests they found something, took samples, but were overrun before they could leave the building. The abandoned research equipment and documents told a partial story. Clipboard notes mentioned project remediation specimens and containment protocols. They knew what they were dealing with, or at least had strong suspicions about the origin of the outbreak. Through the observation window, Sarah was deteriorating rapidly. The fruiting bodies behind her ears had grown larger, branching into delicate structures that would soon release spores. Yet remarkably, she maintained enough awareness to continue documenting her symptoms. Her medical training gave her a unique perspective on her own infection. The compound isn't attacking the fungus directly, I explained as I examined the test cultures. It's strengthening the body's natural antifungal responses, teaching the immune system to recognize the invader. Tom had been maintaining watch near the barricaded door. "Someone's coming," he whispered suddenly. Multiple footsteps, coordinated. We fell silent, listening to the methodical approach of what could only be infected. Their movements were too regular, too purposeful for panicked survivors. I peered through the small reinforced window in the cultivation chamber door. James was leading them. My former colleague walked at the front of a group of about 8 infected, his movements more controlled than the others. Behind him came infected, lab technicians, a security guard, and what appeared to be military personnel still wearing tattered hazmat suits. "It's James," I whispered. "He's brought others. They're organized." "How many?" Tom gripped his baseball bat tighter. 8 that I can see, but there could be more." Linda looked frightened but resolute. "Why are they targeting us specifically? There must be other survivors in town." "The research," I realized. "James knows what I'm working on. The fungal network wants to eliminate potential threats." This confirmation of James's earlier statement was chilling. The infected weren't just gathering randomly. They were organizing, targeting centers of potential resistance. And now they had brought force to bear specifically against our work. The infected weren't just gathering, I explained quickly. They were organizing. James had brought them here deliberately. They were learning, adapting, and they wanted my research. Through the window, I watched James examining the corridor outside our chamber. He moved with unsettling purpose, touching walls and door frames, seemingly communicating with the fungal growth spreading across the building's surfaces. "He's communing with the network," I whispered. "Sharing information." A sudden banging on the door made us jump. It wasn't random, pounding, but a deliberate pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. A human pattern. "Graft?" James's voice came through the door, raspy but intelligible. "We know you're developing something in there. The network is concerned." The surreal nature of negotiating with an infected colleague wasn't lost on me. "James, if you retain any humanity, you'll let us continue. This could help people." "People aren't the priority anymore," he replied with disturbing calm. "The network is evolving, becoming something greater than individual hosts." The others looked to me for guidance. I had no tactical training, no experience with siege situations. My expertise was fungi, not survival. But somehow, I had become the leader of our small group. The cultivation chamber was designed to keep contaminants out, I told them quietly. Now it would keep the infected at bay, at least for a while. The walls are reinforced. The ventilation system has multiple filtration layers. They can't get in easily. Tom pointed to the observation room where Sarah was now slumped against the glass, her movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. "What about her? Is that room secure?" I nodded. "Separate ventilation system. Even if she releases spores, they won't reach us here." The infected outside began a systematic examination of our defenses, testing doors, vents, and windows. Their coordinated approach suggested strategic thinking beyond individual capabilities. The fungal network was functioning as a distributed intelligence, using its hosts as tools. I returned to my work with renewed urgency, knowing our security was temporary at best. The inhibitor strain continued to show promise in test cultures, creating boundaries that the infectious fungus couldn't easily cross. The challenge would be formulating it for human application. "I need to test it on an infected human," I said finally, looking toward the observation room. Linda followed my gaze. "Sarah, but she's almost fully turned." "That's exactly why I need to try. If it works even partially on advanced infection, it could be more effective on early stages." The ethical implications were troubling. Sarah was still technically our ally, even as the infection claimed her mind. But she had explicitly offered herself as a research subject, knowing this moment might come. I prepared a syringe with the experimental compound, diluted in a saline solution. Based on my understanding of the infection pathway, intravenous application would distribute it most effectively through the body. "Tom, I need you to help me," I said, gathering supplies. "We'll need to restrain her. The infection increases strength and aggression." "Is this safe?" Linda asked. "For you, I mean." "No," I admitted. "But waiting isn't safe either." We entered the observation room through its sealed door, moving cautiously. Sarah was still recognizably herself physically, apart from the fungal growths emerging from behind, her ears and along her jawline. But her eyes had developed that milky film we'd seen in other infected. She reacted to our entrance with a jerky turn of her head. For a moment, I thought she would attack. But instead, she made a visible effort to control herself. "Test, test," she croaked, her voice strained. "Hurry." Tom secured her to the examination chair with restraints designed for patient safety. She didn't resist, though her muscles spasmed involuntarily. "I'm going to administer the compound intravenously," I explained, preparing her arm. "It's an inhibitor strain that may slow the fungal progression." She nodded jerkily, then suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Record everything," she managed, "for others." The injection process was straightforward, but the reaction was immediate and violent. Sarah convulsed against the restraints, her back arching, eyes rolling back. A concerning reaction, but not necessarily negative from a treatment perspective. The fungus was responding defensively. We retreated to the main chamber to observe through the glass. For nearly an hour, Sarah alternated between violent spasms and complete stillness. The fruiting bodies on her skin seemed to shrivel slightly, their color dulling from bright white to a grayish tone. "Is it working?" Linda asked hopefully. "It's doing something," I answered cautiously. The compound wasn't attacking the fungus directly. It was strengthening her body's natural antifungal responses, teaching her immune system to recognize the invader. Meanwhile, the infected outside continued their methodical testing of our defenses. The banging had stopped, replaced by more concerning sounds of tools being used against ventilation access points. James was directing them with gestures and what sounded like verbal instructions. His retained intelligence made him infinitely more dangerous than a standard infected. Through the observation window, Sarah had gone still. For a terrifying moment, I thought we'd killed her. Then her eyes opened. The milky film remained, but there was awareness behind it that had been absent before. "Graft," she mouthed, barely audible through the glass. "Partial effect. Brainstem still compromised." She was communicating. The treatment hadn't cured her, but it had restored some cognitive function. This was a significant breakthrough. If the compound could partially reverse advanced infection, it might completely halt early stages. I documented everything meticulously, knowing this information could save countless lives if we could distribute it. The compound formula, application method, observed effects, all recorded on the laboratory's backup systems and in handwritten notes. "The treatment doesn't reverse advanced infection," I explained to the Jensens. "The neural damage is too extensive, but it can halt progression if administered early enough." A loud crash from the corridor interrupted our moment of triumph. The infected had breached the outer laboratory area and were now directly outside the cultivation chamber. Through the doctor window, I could see James directing the others as they brought a heavy piece of equipment to use as a battering ram. "We need to broadcast this information," I said urgently. "Even if we don't make it, others need to know what we've discovered." The laboratory's emergency systems included a communication array on the roof, designed for transmitting data during power outages or other emergencies. If we could reach it, we might be able to broadcast our findings on emergency frequencies. But getting there meant leaving our secure chamber and navigating through infected-filled corridors to the roof access, an almost suicidal proposition. "There's another way," Tom suggested, pointing to the building schematics on the wall. "Service shaft runs from this floor to the mechanical room on the roof for HVAC maintenance." The access point was inside, our cultivation chamber hidden behind equipment racks. A tight fit, but potentially navigable. I gathered the essential data, hard drives, written notes, and samples of the inhibitor culture sealed in protective containers. "I'll go," I said. "You two stay here and keep working on producing more of the compound." Linda shook her head, firmly. "We stay together. We've seen what happens when people separate." She was right. Division had cost us Martin, Sarah, and countless others. Our strength was in unity. Together we moved the equipment rack and opened the service shaft access panel. The narrow vertical tunnel stretched upward, maintenance ladders bolted to one wall. As we prepared to climb, a new sound drew our attention. Sarah was tapping on the observation room glass, her movements purposeful. She was writing something with her finger, using condensation on the glass. A warning. "Red coming." As if on cue, new infected appeared behind James in the corridor. These were different. The fungal growths on their bodies weren't the pure white we'd become accustomed to, but a reddish hue with more complex branching patterns. Second-generation infected, as James had described them. The red growths represent a second-generation infection, I explained quickly. The fungus is learning from each host it takes, incorporating useful neural pathways. The network is becoming a distributed intelligence. One of the red infected was a military officer, still wearing tattered hazmat gear. He carried a weapon, the first armed infected we'd encountered. The fungal network was adapting, learning to use human tools. "We need to go now," Tom urged, "before they break through." I took one last look at Sarah. She nodded at me through the glass, a human gesture of farewell from a face increasingly obscured by fungal structures. She had given us invaluable data at the cost of her humanity. I silently promised to make her sacrifice meaningful. The service shaft was claustrophobic and dusty, but mercifully free of fungal growth. The drier environment was less hospitable to spore germination. We climbed in tense silence, hearing the distant sounds of the infected breaking into the cultivation chamber below us. The mechanical room on the roof contained the building's HVE systems and the emergency communication array. I connected our data to the transmission system, setting it to broadcast continuously on all emergency frequencies. I don't know who's receiving this, I recorded as an introduction, but I'm broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. The formula requires basic chemistry equipment found in any high school lab. I detailed the infection mechanism, treatment approach, and observed effects. I emphasized the importance of early intervention and included warnings about the red infected and their enhanced capabilities. Everything we had learned at such great cost now transmitted to anyone still able to receive. From the roof, we could see Barrows Point in its entirety. The coastal town was transformed. White fungal growth visible even from this distance, spreading across buildings and streets like a snowfall. Movement was visible throughout, infected moving with that unsettling coordination, gathering around certain structures. They're not just spreading randomly, I observed. They're targeting centers of potential resistance, hospitals, police stations, research facilities, and they're being directed by coordinator hosts like James. The pattern was clearer from our elevated position. The infected concentrated around places with resources, information, or strategic value. The fungal intelligence was developing military strategy, using human infrastructure knowledge gained from its hosts. Our momentary advantage of height soon ended as infected began emerging onto the roof from other access points. Among them was James moving with unsettling purpose, flanked by red infected with their more complex fungal structures. They're evolving into something more dangerous than mere hosts, I warned in my final transmission. This isn't the end. It's adaptation. Humans have survived countless plagues before. We'll survive this one too. We retreated to the mechanical room, barricading the door. The transmission was sending, the information spreading beyond our isolated town. Whether anyone would receive it, understand it, or be able to use it remained uncertain. But we had done what we could with the knowledge we had. Tom and Linda stood beside me, watching the door shake as the infected attempted to break through. Their fear was evident but contained, channeled into resolute action rather than panic. In just 36 hours, they had transformed from shocked survivors to capable allies. What happens now? Linda asked quietly. We keep working, I answered. We have samples, equipment, we can produce more of the compound. I glanced at the remaining cultures we'd brought with us. Limited, but enough to continue research. Enough to produce treatments for ourselves and any other survivors we might find. Through the small window in the mechanical room door, I could see James observing our barricade. His eyes met mine, and, for a moment I saw recognition there, not just fungal intelligence using his brain, but some remnant of my colleague and friend. He touched the door, not banging, but almost a gesture of communication. Coordinator infected like James retain. Partial awareness, I explained to the Jensens. They're used by the network for strategic thinking, planning. They remember their human knowledge but apply it to fungal goals. It was both horrifying and fascinating from a scientific perspective. The fungus hadn't just invaded our bodies. It had adapted our cognitive capabilities, created a hierarchy of specialized hosts. Evolution in real time. Remarkable if it weren't so deadly. The infected outside seemed to be conferring, James gesturing to the others in what appeared to be a planning session. Their coordination was becoming more sophisticated with each hour. Soon they would find a way through our defenses. But we weren't finished. Not yet. The cultivation chamber had been breached, but we had brought essential supplies to continue our work. As long as we had samples of the inhibitor strain, we had hope of refining the treatment. I looked at Tom and Linda, these strangers who had become my research team through apocalyptic circumstance. We keep working, I repeated. For Martin, for Sarah, for everyone still out there. They nodded, fear giving way to determination. Together, we turned away from the door and began setting up our improvised laboratory in the corner of the mechanical room. Outside, the infected continued their methodical assault on our sanctuary. Inside, we continued our methodical assault on the infection. The race between human ingenuity and fungal adaptation had only just begun. We've been in the mechanical room for 6 hours now. The infected have stopped their direct assault on the door, which concerns me more than if they had continued. It suggests strategic thinking, conservation of energy perhaps, or preparation for a more effective approach. I'm recording this update to our broadcast in case anyone is receiving our transmission. Sarah's condition has stabilized. Through our makeshift observation window, we can see she's regained limited motor control and basic communication abilities. The treatment didn't reverse her advanced infection. The neural damage was too extensive. But it halted progression and restored some cognitive function. This confirms my theory that the compound would be more effective on early-stage infection. The treatment works by introducing a competitive fungal strain, I explained to Tom and Linda as we watched Sarah through the window. It doesn't kill the infectious fungus directly, but it competes for the same resources and neural pathways, preventing further colonization. Using the limited equipment we salvaged, I've refined the formula to make it more effective against the red variant infections. The original compound works well against the white stage infected, but the red growth show greater resistance. They represent a second-generation infection, where the fungus has incorporated more efficient neural integration techniques. Linda has shown remarkable aptitude for laboratory work. With minimal instruction, she's helped prepare additional batches of the treatment. Her steady hands and precise measurements would impress even seasoned lab technicians. I worked as a pharmacy assistant before opening the grocery store, she explained when I commented on her skill. Never thought I'd use those skills like this. Tom has been maintaining our defenses, reinforcing the door barricade and monitoring infected movements through the small window. He reports increasing numbers of red infected among the group outside, confirming my fears about the accelerating evolution. They're changing how they organize, he noted. The red ones seem to give orders that even James follows now. Hierarchy is shifting. This observation aligns with my theory about fungal adaptation. The network is becoming more sophisticated, developing specialized roles for different hosts. The red infected appear to be emerging as higher-level coordinators, with white infected like James now serving as mid-level functionaries. I've taken samples from Sarah through the sealed transfer port in the observation chamber. The close examination reveals fascinating details about the fungal structure. Under the microscope, I can see the mycelium network integrating with her nervous system in ways I've never observed in any natural fungus. The precision suggests deliberate engineering rather than random mutation. The red growths represent a second-generation infection, I explained as Tom and Linda examined the microscope images. The fungus is learning from each host it takes, incorporating useful neural pathways. The network is becoming a distributed intelligence. This adaptation makes the red infected particularly dangerous. They retain more of their human knowledge and skills, while being completely subservient to the fungal network. The military officer we observed earlier is a perfect example, tactical training and weapons knowledge now serving fungal purposes. They're not just spreading randomly, I emphasized. They're targeting centers of potential resistance, hospitals, police stations, research facilities, and they're being directed by coordinator hosts like James. Our rooftop position provides a disturbing overview of Barrow's Point. From here, I can see patterns of infection spread that weren't visible at street level. The fungus has established what appear to be central nodes throughout town, buildings completely overtaken by growth that serve as hubs for the network. The infected travel between these nodes in regular patterns like information packets in a computer network. Most concerning is the harbor area, where the infection originated. The growth there has formed a massive structure unlike anything elsewhere. In town, a central processing unit for the distributed fungal brain. I can see infected converging there regularly, perhaps downloading new instructions or uploading gathered information. It's creating a physical neural network, I realized, pointing it out to the others. Using the town's infrastructure as its architecture and infected humans as mobile nodes. This insight may prove crucial for resistance efforts. If the fungal network relies on physical connections between growth centers, disrupting those connections could impair its coordination abilities. The information goes into my broadcast along with updated treatment formulations. Sarah has been trying to communicate through written notes held against the observation window. Her latest message confirms my suspicions about the network's structure. As a partially integrated node, she receives fragments of information, not complete control signals, but enough to understand the system's architecture. Coordinators, her shaky handwriting reads. Different types. James, information. Red, owns command. Nodes, owns memory. This organizational structure mirrors human brain. Function, specialized cells for different aspects of cognition. The fungus isn't just parasitizing our bodies, it's replicating our neural organization on a town-wide scale. The treatment continues to maintain Sarah's partial consciousness, but I've observed concerning developments in the fungal structures on her skin. They're changing color, developing orangish tints in some areas, perhaps a response to the inhibitor compound. The fungus is already adapting to our treatment. We need to broadcast this information, I said urgently. Even if we don't make it, others need to know what we've discovered. Tom has rigged a more powerful transmission system using components from the building's telecommunications equipment. Our broadcast now reaches further, potentially connecting with emergency services or military frequencies beyond our immediate area. The compound isn't attacking the fungus directly. It's strengthening the body's natural antifungal responses, teaching the immune system to recognize the invader. This approach makes it harder for the fungus to develop resistance, though not impossible as Sarah's changing growth suggest. I've included the complete formula in my broadcast, detailing precise measurements and synthesis methods. The formula requires basic chemistry equipment found in any high school lab, I emphasized. Filtration apparatus, centrifuge, microscope, growth medium. The inhibitor strain can be cultured from common soil fungi with the right selective pressures. Our resources are limited, but we've managed to produce enough of the compound for ourselves and a small reserve. If the infected breach our sanctuary, we'll at least have protection against initial infection, buying time to escape or find new shelter. Linda has been monitoring Sarah's vital signs remotely. Her core temperature is normalizing, she reported. Heart rate stabilizing. Whatever the compound is doing, it's helping her body fight back. This is valuable data. The treatment seems most effective at regulating the physiological stress the infection places on host systems. It doesn't remove the fungus, but it helps the body establish a less harmful equilibrium with it. Not a cure, but a management approach that could keep people functional during early infection stages. Tom spotted a new development through the observation window. They're bringing something, looks like equipment. Through his binoculars, we could see infected dragging what appeared to be an industrial air handling unit toward the building. James was directing them, pointing to external ventilation ducts. They were planning to introduce spores directly into our air supply. They're adapting their tactics, I noted, using human knowledge of building systems. We quickly sealed all ventilation access points in our room with tape and plastic sheeting from our protective gear. The filtration system in my mask would provide additional protection if spores penetrated our defenses. As I worked, I continued documenting our observations for the broadcast. The infected avoid concentrated vinegar vapor and UV light in the 300-310 nanometer range, I explained. It disrupts their ability to release viable spores. Household blacklights aren't strong enough, but commercial insect zappers can be modified to emit the correct wavelength. This discovery came from observing the infected's reaction to different light sources. They actively avoided the UV sterilization lamps in the laboratory's decontamination area, suggesting sensitivity to specific wavelengths. Using this knowledge, Tom rigged a defensive perimeter of UV lamps around our workstation. The infected couldn't see the light directly, but they would encounter an invisible barrier that damaged their reproductive capabilities if they breached our room. I turned my attention to analyzing the red-tinted growth samples we'd collected. Under the microscope, they revealed structural differences from the white variant. More complex branching patterns, denser hyphal networks, more efficient integration with host neural tissue. The fungus was evolving rapidly, developing specialized structures for different functions. The red growths are a second-generation infection, I recorded for the broadcast. More efficient neural integration, better resistance to environmental stressors, potentially capable of more sophisticated host control. This evolution might explain why some infected retained more human capabilities than others. The fungus was selectively preserving useful neural pathways while repurposing others, a kind of neural pruning similar to what happens in human brain development, but directed by fungal intelligence rather than natural growth patterns. Sarah's latest communication was alarming. Network expanding, she wrote. Planning spread, beyond town. Spores and water supply. If the fungus had contaminated Barrows Point's reservoir, the infection could spread to neighboring communities through municipal water connections. The containment failure would become exponential. I immediately added this warning to our broadcast. Check water supplies. Boil all water before consumption or contact. The spores can survive standard chlorine treatment levels. The infected outside had ceased their visible activity, but we could hear them working on something in the corridor. Mechanical sounds, tools being used with purpose. They were problem-solving using human knowledge integrated into the fungal network. They're not just spreading randomly, I reiterated in my broadcast. They're targeting centers of potential, resistance, hospitals, police stations, research facilities, and they're being directed by coordinator hosts like James. Understanding these patterns could help other survivors predict infected movements and avoid concentration areas. The fungal intelligence was sophisticated, but still followed recognizable optimization strategies: efficient spread, resource acquisition, information gathering. Linda spotted something through the window that confirmed this theory. They're gathering electronics, she reported. Phones, radios, anything with transmission capability. The fungus wasn't just expanding physically, it was attempting to block communications, isolate survivor groups from each other. A classic military strategy now employed by a fungal hive mind. Some people seem naturally resistant, I noted, adding this observation to our broadcast. Their immune systems recognize the fungus immediately. If we can isolate that resistance factor, we might develop a more effective treatment. This insight came from analyzing why some exposed individuals converted more slowly than others. Sarah, despite direct exposure at the hospital, had progressed more gradually than Martin or Tommy. Genetic factors likely played a role in resistance, offering another potential treatment avenue if we could identify the specific immune responses involved. The treatment we developed isn't perfect. It doesn't reverse advanced infection. The neural damage is too extensive, but it can halt progression if administered early enough. I'm including the complete formula in this recording, along with application methods and expected outcomes. Tom has been documenting the fungal growth patterns visible from our vantage point, creating detailed maps of infection concentration areas. These patterns reveal the strategic intelligence behind the spread: focused colonization of key infrastructure, followed by systematic expansion to surrounding areas. Check yourself every 2 hours for unusual itching or light sensitivity, I advised in my broadcast. Sleep in shifts, and remember, spores settle on surfaces like dust. Keep moving in infected areas. These practical guidelines emerged from our observations of infection vectors and progression patterns. Early detection significantly improved. Treatment outcomes making regular self-examination crucial for survival. Sarah's condition remained stable but concerning. The fungal structures on her skin continue to adapt, changing color and form in response to our treatment. It's almost as if we're engaged in an evolutionary arms race in miniature. Our inhibitor strain versus the infectious fungus, each adapting to counter the other's strategies. A sudden series of impacts against our barricade indicated renewed assault by the infected. Through the small window we could see they had fashioned a makeshift battering ram from ventilation ducting. James directed their efforts, positioning them for maximum effectiveness. Behind him, the red infected observed. Without participating directly, command and control elements supervising the operation. They're organizing like a military unit, Tom observed. Specialized roles, clear command structure. This level of coordination suggested the fungal network was reaching new levels of complexity. What had begun as simple parasitic infection was evolving into something more akin to a collective intelligence, using human hosts as specialized components in a distributed system. I added this assessment to our broadcast, emphasizing the escalating threat posed by coordinated infected. The network is becoming smarter with each host it takes, incorporating neural architectures and knowledge into its distributed intelligence. Linda continued monitoring Sarah, whose communication had become more sporadic but remained lucid when it occurred. Her latest note read simply, "Others like me. Partial integration. Aware, but controlled." This confirmed my suspicion that the fungus maintained varying levels of host consciousness depending on its needs. Some infected retained awareness, others were reduced to purely mechanical functions. A disturbing spectrum of mental imprisonment. One last thing, I added to my broadcast. If you encounter infected with red-tinted growths instead of the typical white ones, keep your distance at all costs. They represent an evolved strain with enhanced capabilities and intelligence. The impacts against our door were becoming more coordinated, more forceful. The barricade wouldn't hold indefinitely. We gathered our essential research materials, treatment samples, documentation, and synthesis instructions, preparing for possible retreat. Our current situation in the barricaded mechanical room is precarious. We have limited supplies but continue researching. The few treatment doses we've produced provide some security, potentially preventing infection if we're exposed during escape or confrontation. Looking out over Barrows Point from our elevated position, I can see the infection has transformed the town. White fungal growth covers buildings and streets like a bizarre snowfall, with distinct patterns revealing the network's architecture. Red growth centers stand out at strategic locations, the evolved strain establishing command nodes throughout the colony. Some people seem naturally resistant. Their immune systems recognize the fungus immediately. If we can isolate that resistance factor, we might develop a more effective treatment. This observation offers hope that human biology already contains defenses against this engineered threat. Defenses that could be enhanced or replicated. The fungal structures have continued adapting, developing new morphologies even as we observe them. Nature always finds a way. In this case, an engineered organism returning to natural evolutionary principles, adapting to overcome obstacles and exploit opportunities. This isn't the end, I emphasized in my final broadcast section. It's adaptation. Humans have survived countless plagues before. We'll survive this one too. Stay alive. Stay human. As I conclude this transmission, I want to leave clear instructions for anyone receiving our signal. The treatment formula is attached in full detail. Implementation requires basic laboratory equipment, but can be accomplished with high school-level facilities. Early intervention is crucial. Effectiveness decreases significantly after neural colonization reaches advanced stages. For those without access to laboratory equipment, preventative measures remain your best defense. Avoid damp environments where spores germinate easily. Use vinegar-soaked masks to create inhospitable conditions for spore germination and respiratory passages. Expose suspicious materials to UV light when possible. Maintain regular body temperature through adequate rest and nutrition, as fever responses help combat early infection. The infected avoid concentrated vinegar vapor and UV light in the 300-310 nanometer range. It disrupts their ability to release viable spores. Household blacklights aren't strong enough, but commercial insect zappers can be modified to emit the correct wavelength. Most importantly, understand what we're facing. This isn't mindless infection but emerging intelligence. A network learning from each host it claims, adapting to overcome resistance, developing strategy and purpose beyond simple reproduction. One last warning. If you encounter infected with red-tinted growths instead of the typical white ones, keep your distance at all costs. They're evolving into something more dangerous than mere hosts. They represent command nodes in the network, retaining human knowledge while serving fungal purposes. This isn't the end. It's adaptation. Humans have survived countless plagues before. We'll survive this one too. Stay alive. Stay human. I'll broadcast again when I can.